as an avant-garde movement that started in the 1930s, lay the ground for destabilizing gender norms, a truth that has not yet really preoccupied English language critics. So to begin today, I just want to hold aloft just some thinking by Susan Rubin Suleiman, who actually wrote a book about gender in the avant-garde over 30 years ago. Her book, Subversive Intent, unfortunately, some of it does still pertain to contemporary thinking in a way that you might hope it would have moved on. But Suleiman in Subversive Intent is thinking through how, as an artistic subject, a subject of art, woman, capital W, woman, tends to be positioned in 20th century avant-gardes as a symbol divorced from the lived reality of females, people who identify as women. As an avant-garde symbol, woman is a site of obsession, objectification, and idealization. And as a symbol, woman remains a degraded target, indissociable from an aggressed against status quo in avant-garde art. So what the woman as the subject of vanguard art is not, according to Susan Suleiman, is herself. Suleiman writes, insofar as the dominant culture has been not only bourgeois, but also patriarchal, the production of most male avant-garde artists appear anything but subversive. And then she asks this question: why is it a woman who embodies most fully the paradoxical combination of pleasure and anguish that characterizes avant-garde transgression, in whose body, in other words, the contradictory impulses toward excess and respect for boundaries are played out? I'm in this conversation right now about Suleiman suggesting that the avant-garde is locked in an Oedipal drama. So she suggests that the avant-garde has enacted a transgression of phallic law in which phallic law thus far always wins. And this confrontation, she writes, is staged there we go. It's a confrontation staged over and across the body of the mother. So we might argue that this is a kind of fierce intimacy in and of itself, that the avant-garde, as the fierce intimacy of my title, right? The avant-garde is at odds with the female body, and the female body is made maternal. Suleiman's evidence is drawn from a litany of white male European sources, primarily surrealistic and psychoanalytic. So she draws from people like Freud, Georges Bataille, the Marquis de Sade. She does not aspire really to a global or a diverse point of view. And in this regard, her book is dated. It is sort of behind. It's not very diverse. But I want to argue today that the confrontation she discerns is really visible within Black Power. So Black Power is an avant-garde movement, and it too is interested, as she suggests, in the maternal. We might, for instance, look at the activist scholar Julius Lester's 1968 publication, Look at Whitey, Black Power is Going to Get Your Mama, right? So here we have Lester playing on the African-American street tradition of the dozens, which is often cited as a precursor to rap and hip hop. I'm sure most of you will be familiar with the dozens. It involves a kind of competitive verbal sparring. It's a kind of street art form in which participants talk about sexual liberties that they have taken with their opponent's mother. But less comically, so this is obviously quite a funny and meant to be sort of a funny title to a text, but less comically, we might consider Amiri Baraka's poem Black Art, which was written in 1969. And in it, these are the lyrics of Baraka's poem. He advocates writing Black poems to smear on girdle mama mulatto bitches whose brains are red jelly stuck between Elizabeth Taylor's toes, stinking whores. So here's another version of the avant-garde playing itself out across the body of the mother. And it's obviously considerably less comical than Lester. What follows, I want to diversify Suleiman's claim that the avant-garde stages confrontation over women and mothers and I want to extend that idea to really all feminized bodies. And by feminized bodies, I mean not only women, but queered and colonized subjects. So Feminized bodies, I argue, are fecund or eroticized. They're fecund in that they're perceived as propagative, as yielding, as a site of abundance for other people. They are eroticized in that they are fetishized, subjected to imposed and aggressive intimacies. And these somatic categories, fecundity and eroticization, are perpetuated. Great. Okay. So I'm going to move now to Fran Ross's Oreo. This is an Italian translation that I'm showing you here at the cover of the novel. Fran Ross publishes her first and only novel, Oreo, in 1974. 1974 is 9 years after the assassination of Malcolm X that catalyzed, obviously, the Black Power movement. It's 8 years after the founding of Black Power's best-known organization, the Black Panthers. And Fran Ross is an interesting figure in that, like many female vanguard writers, she's kind of on the margins of the Black arts movement. She's never actually sort of integral to that movement, but she operates on its margins. And the Black arts movement is an extension, a kind of aestheticized extension of Black Power. Oreo is published a year before Hélène Cixous's very famous essay, The Laugh of the Medusa, which is a manifesto, as Suleiman describes it, for female vanguard practice. Like Suleiman, Cixous maintains that women lack self-definition. Like Suleiman, Cixous asserts that a woman is never far from mother, the mother as non-name and source of goods. Whose job it is, according to Cixous, to give others their self-definition. And like Suleiman, Cixous believes that women must return to the body because, as she writes, a woman without a body, dumb, blind, can't possibly be a good fighter. She is reduced to being the servant of the militant male, his shadow. For Cixous, women should aim to break up phallic law, phallic truth with laughter. And that women should resist the mother figure, that they should fight, and that they should laugh as much as they can, are mainstays, I would argue, of Fran Ross's satiric comical novel, which responds to Black Power in profoundly feminist terms. Oreo is a novel that toys with the mass perception of Black Power as a masculinist, heroic movement, a reception that defined American consciousness between 1965 and 1975. So Oreo, the name of the book, is also the name of our protagonist, whose given name, in fact, is Christine Clark. Oreo is the offspring of a Jewish father who deserts the family, and a Black mother who is a university-educated mathematician and musician. So Oreo is half Black and she's half white, like the cookie. And this is the play that Ross is making. Her lineage signals the integrationist ideologies of the civil rights movement and the combined protests of African and Jewish Americans through the 1960s and 1970s. But her lineage, I think, is also a covert challenge to Black Power nationalism and cultural separatism. So Black Power rejects civil rights integrationism. It's against the notion of integration and wants to be separate. But unlike Stokely Carmichael, one of the famous leaders of Black Power, Oreo cannot quite state, I am Black, therefore I am, because she is so defined by her Jewish heritage as well. Instead, Fran Ross, who is a Black woman, offers her reader a scale of Blackness in the novel. So this is just lifted from one of the pages of the novel. And this scale of Blackness begins with white, thereby subsuming whiteness into Blackness, while insisting that there is no pure Black. So this is a novel that loves to poke fun at the rigid taxonomies, and Ross ranks all of her characters by this particular color scale. So against the stereotype of the absent African-American father, Oreo's Black mother is the person who is constantly away from her children. She's supporting them financially, but she's always on tour as a pianist. And she leaves Oreo and her brother in Philadelphia with their grandparents. Oreo refuses to go to school and is supported in this refusal by her family, who hires a professor to teach her. Oreo, as it turns out, is a natural autodidact. She's hyper-literate, she's verbally quick, she's a phenomenal strategist who perpetually calculates and assesses. She engages in verbal duels and puns, and she coins neologisms. As her novel opens, Oreo is 14 years old, And on a rare visit from her mother, she is given a list of clues from her father about the secret of her parentage. And these clues inspire Oreo's curiously feminist, but also very white Western quest to know more about her absent father, one that mimics the terms of the Greek hero Theseus. And here is where Ross, you can see, is engaging in a kind of avant-garde tradition, where Joyce, for instance, famously rewrites the Odyssey in Ulysses. Ross is rewriting the Greek hero Theseus and his story of killing the Minotaur, etc. Through this figure of this 14-year-old African-American girl in the 1970s. The quest sends Oreo to New York, where she has a series of confrontations from which she always emerges victorious. And these confrontations are with pimps, they are with would-be rapists, subway villains, and with a group of rogue Amazons that are attacking men in Central Park. So they're kind of this curious countercultural underbelly of New York City is what Oreo comes into contact with. So we witness Oreo's capacity to overcome early in the novel, shortly after her uncle returns from a trip to Africa. So, having purchased a coat made from a lion's skin, her uncle throws it over the chair on which he sits, and the coat's intact head gnawing away at his back. What happens after this is that child Oreo enters the room and believes that the coat is a real lion. She begins stalking this creature, ultimately killing it, quote unquote, by strangling it with a well-deployed skipping rope. And her uncle is impressed. Bear in mind that Oreo is about 6 or 7 years old as this is happening. And this is what he says. She sure got womb, that little mother, he said. I wouldn't want to mess with her when she gets older. She is a ball buster and a half. He told the entire neighborhood about the incident. So it was that the legend of Oreo began to grow before she had cut her second teeth. Hey, Joseph, can I just do a check-in that you can still hear me?
Right.
Okay, super. Okay. So when Oreo's mother tells her that women's oppression is rooted in men's superior physical power, so this is how the facts of life are relayed to her in this very feminist way, Oreo develops a system of self-defense that improves upon the supreme moves of karate, judo, and kung fu. And Oreo's system of self-defense aims at the body's soft, vulnerable places, or generates such spaces where she believes they had not previously existed. And this method, Oreo, as I say, who's very literate, calls the way of interstitial thrust, or wit. The way of interstitial thrust. So wit is clearly a nod to the feminist satire that we are reading. As per Hélène Cixous, laughter breaks phallic law. And at the same time, in this kind of acronym that Ross creates, it is also appropriating phallic thrust, right? So there's a kind of play on and a joke at the expense of phallic law. So the interstitiality furthers Ross's binary challenge. So she's constantly messing with binaries through this entire novel, black, white, male, female. And this in-betweenness is kind of a lived condition as well as a defense for Oreo, who's constantly resisting category. But as a system of self-defense, Oreo's wit clearly echoes the Panthers, also known as the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. That's its full title. As is well known, the Black Panthers quickly became a national and then an international organization. And in the US, they used armed patrols to resist police violence against African Americans with great success. The Panthers deployed legal knowledge of citizen rights alongside what Panther founder Huey P. Newton called shakabuku tactics. Shakabuku. So shakabuku involved behaving with strange inconsistency against the expectations of legal authority, surprising one's opponent. And the Black Panthers were, by their own description, a vanguard, right? They were a self-proclaimed vanguard. They worked in the front lines of at-risk neighborhoods. They used shock as a tactic. They're very much within an avant-garde tradition. Ross's Oreo is a kind of one-woman vanguard movement who beats patriarchal law again and again. She uses her own shakabuku tactics, and she subverts the education system, sexual harassers, and by discovering, as we do by the novel's end, that she was conceived by artificial insemination, the phallic potency of even her own father. And I think one of the things that's really notable about this novel is that although Oreo has one confrontation after another, she never has a confrontation with the police, even at a time when police confrontation between the police and African Americans was national news on a regular basis, courtesy of the Black Panthers. Ross avoids having her character, her protagonist, challenge the police, I think because her challenge is more to patriarchy itself as a kind of writ large sort of institution rather than targeting the police. This is a kind of typical line of how Oreo is described. She was ready for any kind of shit, prepared to go where she was not wanted, to butt in where she had no business, to test her mettle all over the map. Oreo was one pushy chick. And of course, metal should be metal, right? But metal is a kind of feminization of metal, right? At the meddling female. Oreo's motto in the concluding line of her novel is as follows: "No one attacks me with impunity." That's the last line of the book. The Panther founder, Huey P. Newton, similarly ends his 1973 autobiography with a kind of similar ethos. "You cannot bare your throat to the murderer," writes Newton. For Huey P. Newton, physical and political fighting affirms masculinity and dignity. By fighting, he resists dehumanization and embarks upon a process of self-discovery. And Ross is presenting these experiences as Oreos, and she's a 14-year-old girl. But where Black Power and the Panthers extolled unification, Oreo is defiantly individualistic, answering to no one if seeking out lines of continuity and heritage. Oreo simply will not be what Cixous calls the servant of the militant male. That said, Fran Ross knew that women had a strong presence in Black Power, one that's just recently being recovered by scholars. Like any US citizen, Ross would have been exposed to the sensationalized trials of figures like Angela Davis and Assata Shakur, both of whom were charged with murder due to affiliations with, in Davis's case, the Panthers, or in Shakur's case, with the Black Liberation Army. Popularized misogynistic images of violent or sexualized women in Black Power are at the heart of what was a very famous book in 1978, which was Michelle Wallace's Black Macho and the Myth of the Superwoman. Wallace has since retracted some of the statements that she makes in this book, but some of it really does sort of carry on with a contemporary relevance. In it, Wallace takes umbrage with the sexism of Black Power and charges it with perpetuating stereotypes, including the fundamental image of Black woman, which she describes as follows. The fundamental image of Black woman is of a woman of inordinate strength, with an ability for tolerating an unusual amount of misery and heavy, distasteful work. This woman does not have the same fears, weaknesses, and insecurities as other women, but believes herself to be, and is, in fact, stronger emotionally than most men. Less of a woman in that she is less feminine, quote unquote, and helpless. She is really more of a woman in that she is the embodiment of Mother Earth, the quintessential mother with infinite sexual, life-giving, and nurturing reserves. In other words, she is a superwoman. So Wallace's superwoman, this category that she's calling on, is central to the infamous Moynihan Report of 1965. So this was a report that was commissioned by Lyndon B. Johnson's government in the United States, and it was called The Negro Family, A Case for National Action. So it's 1965, and in it, Moynihan, the author, lays the blame for Black unemployment, poor education, and unrest on Black matriarchs who evidently emasculated Black men. Women-headed households Moynihan actually dubs pathological. Some Black Panthers used Moynihan's terms to recruit Black men to the party, promising to reinstate their virility. And emasculating is a charge that is often levied at the female Black Panthers, as they write in their memoirs. So Oreo is a superwoman in many ways in Ross's text, or maybe more accurately, a supergirl, and she's reworking Wallace's coordinates. She refuses to nurture, to work, to live in drudgery, or to partake in sexual intimacy. A lot is made, perhaps too much, in fact, of her virginity and her desire to retain it throughout the novel. She won't be sexualized in any way. But as a supergirl, Oreo transcends subjugation, is, quote unquote, a little mother who will not be attacked. She's heroic, but she's also very everyday. And emergent scholarship shows that if we look beyond Black Power, the Black Power movement's iconic heroism, we find women panthers openly challenging masculine models of radicality. And I offer as an example an image from Ashley Farmer's terrific monograph, which is called Remaking Black Power, How Black Women Transformed an Era. And this image is included in the Black Panther Journal from July 1972. It's drawn by Gail Dixon. And this is an illustration that underscores how, throughout the 1970s, the Black Panthers' militancy increasingly focused on the everyday acts of regular women, domestic workers and mothers, and so on and so forth. And if we look at this close-up, you can see that this woman, again, so this is an image that's in the Black Panther Journal in 72, is shown saying that she supports Black Panther Bobby Seale, who's running for mayor of San Francisco at the time. She partakes of the Black Panther free food programs, and she speaks against the Vietnam War and as a Black nationalist. So, deploying wit, refusing binary, Ross's Oreo operates within similar interstices, turning an everyday girl from Philadelphia into a legendary and radical feminist. This kind of combination of the everyday and the heroic is really integral to the recovery of Black women's activism in the Panthers and beyond. Okay, I'm going to take a pretty serious gear shift here. Joseph, are you okay?
Sounds great.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to now turn to Négritude, which is in fact going back in time. And this is often considered, this particular text that's on the screen right now is considered kind of the first major literary work, and is still one of the major literary works that everyone turns to when thinking through Négritude and its relation to art. Négritude, as some of you I'm aware will be aware, was founded in Paris in the mid-1930s, and it was a movement that aspired to the rebecoming of the Black individual. And this rebecoming was meant to happen through a reclamation of the longue durée of a globally foundational but woefully neglected Black history. As in Fran Ross's Oreo, Négritude seeks generative lines of ancestry and descent, and its very terms are fecund. The Martinican Aimé Césaire, who's I'm going to be focusing on in what remains of this talk, maintained that Négritude sought to demonstrate that an inclusive humanism is not, as he described it, it's not a parched ground. We can have an inclusive humanism, he maintained, that could still bear fruit if we made the effort to irrigate it with our sweat and plant new seeds in it. A co-founder of Négritude, Leopold Senghor, asserts that Négritude, following African tradition, pursued both masculine virility and what he called a feminine element. He believed, Senghor maintained, that Négritude really relied on complementary life forces, masculine interacting with feminine. The next generation of Black activists included Frantz Fanon, who is famously attended the same school as Aimé Césaire. And Fanon was very opposed to Négritude, and he argued that Négritude was unduly passive, a movement that was too keen to promote what he called a Mother Earth bond and a mystic carnal marriage between man and the cosmos. But alongside Malcolm X, Fanon remains a crucial link between Négritude and Black Power. Both Malcolm X and Fanon emphasized revolutionary action first and foremost. Both recognized the value of the Black cultural reclamation that Négritude promulgated. In fact, in a 1964 speech, Malcolm X quoted Senghor and Césaire to argue his point that culture was an indispensable weapon in the freedom struggle. And we know that Césaire went to visit members of Black Power in the late 60s as well. So there was a conversation that was happening there between these movements. But I want to argue today that ultimately the substance of Fanon's critique is not wrong. His suggestion that it's a movement that is quite interested in the fecund, right? Aimé Césaire is openly fascinated, I would argue, by feminized experience and states of being. And his enthrallment, I believe, is inseparable from the emasculation of Black males throughout modernity. Black men have long been infantilized as incompetent, therefore inconveniently in need, I say in quotations, of white paternal overlords. Contrarily and simultaneously, Black men are feared for their physical endurance, a prowess that is sexualized and objectified. And of course, objectification is a very feminized state in many ways. Instead of rejecting his feminization outright, his fetishization by the white male gaze, Césaire's poems dissect the paternalism at the heart of this feminization and turn often to the base and the abject and the subjugated as sites of renewal. It's almost like Césaire kind of doubles down into the feminization of himself as a Black man and extends that into his politics and his aesthetics. And so now I'm going to take quite a turn, which is to say this. From his earliest works, Césaire generates a powerfully feminized ejaculatory economy that reverberates throughout his oeuvre in the volcanic settings of his birthplace and in the explosive language of his poems. And along the way, I think he's trying to articulate alternate models of virility and of intimacy. So again, this is where I'm starting to think about this fierce intimacy in my title. So in order to get to this, I need to give you a short history that you may not have expected today, which is of female ejaculate. So the Greek physician Hippocrates, who was writing in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, was among a number of ancient thinkers who argued that both men's and women's sexual effluvia carried seed that was integral to conception. So this idea that women ejaculate has been around for a very, very long time, about 2,500 years. In turn, the idea that women's sexual juices can gush prolifically at climax was a truth propounded by Western physicians from the 17th into the 20th centuries. And we see there have been moments in time where women's sexual ejaculate has become a kind of cultural fixation. In about the 1980s, there was a real interest in women locating their G-spot. This was also about trying to figure out whether or not women could ejaculate. Where male ejaculate is considered urgently spontaneous and teleological, right, is brief and it ends, women have long reported a capacity in very favorable intimate settings to control, direct, and repeat awe-inspiring voluminous sprays. And there's some way in which this idea that women can ejaculate longer and with less constriction than men that we might think of as potentially emasculating, right, as something that it threatens male prowess. But what I want to argue is that a like ejaculate, this feminine ejaculate, surfaces in Césaire's first long poem, and which is Notebook of a Return to the Native Land. And this is, I'm drawing here on the 1939 version. There are many variants of it, but this is the first and earliest version. And Notebook, as a fabulous and complex epic poem, often portrays women who are ejaculating. In it, there's a peasant woman who urinates while standing upright in the street. The Empress of the French, Josephine, famously associated with Napoleon, is said to hover over colonized scum, a gushing ebullient liquid that surfaces as she is positioned, missionary style, above her intimates. And cueing the maternal body yet again, Césaire presents the Virgin Mary's spermless impregnation with the splashing of privileged moments. And of course, as we know, Mary's is meant to be an asexual reproduction. So this splashing must surely be Mary's alone. Most significantly, though, the feminized landscape of Martinique is suffused with what Césaire describes as a pestilential juice that continually threatens to spurt and overcome the island. So Césaire's colonized homeland is bursting with tepid pustules, or as he puts it, fumaroles of anguish. And a fumarole is a smoke hole, a volcanic smoke hole. So envisioning a return to Martinique from years spent in the Parisian metropole, the speaker of Césaire's notebook fantasizes returning to his homeland and receiving a widely dispersed intimacy, a diffuse tenderness in league with the nurturing pastoral tropes of European romanticism. Instead, this is what he is confronted by. The tormented sensual concentration of the fat tits of the morns, with an occasional palm tree as their hardened sprout, the jerky orgasm of torrents, and from Trinité to Grande Rivière, the hysterical grand suck of the sea. A morn is an eroded mountain or a volcano, an erection that has lost its originary force, masculine gone feminine. Forgetful of exploding, but not lacking the potential to do so, Césaire's mourns are barely restrained sobs, gagged on the verge of a bloodthirsty burst. That's his wording. But a conclusive rupture never comes, as he writes. Where slum or shack life may involuntarily burst like an overripe pomegranate, the town of Fort-de-France, the capital of Martinique, continues to crawl on its hands without the slightest desire to drill the sky with a stature of protest. So this land is prone and enfeebled. Césaire's feminine ejaculatory economy is interpretable as the consequence of imperial rape. And by this reading, the women and the landscape who threaten to engulf Martinique with their emissions could be seen as spermatic receptacles, their menace, the victim's internalization of the enemy's essence. But Césaire believes, and this is the theme that runs throughout his poetry, that injury and spillage, blood, spit, ejaculate can catalyze recreation. And he embraces the possibilities that the perverse portends. Really importantly, the decadent movement is a big influence on Césaire. So he's very interested in the creative potential of perversity. But there's also here a real link with Kristeva and her wonderful Powers of Horror, her book on abjection, where she suggests that the abject is something that we both want to separate ourselves from, but that importantly builds culture, that is really sort of central to how we define ourselves. So as this epic poem of Césaire's Notebook of Return starts to near its own climax, Césaire depicts a slave ship that is cracking from bow to stern and then ejects its human cargo into the sea. This slave ship looks like another pregnant abdomen that is refusing maternal sanctity. It's a wooden belly that literally vomits out the colonized scum over which Empress Josephine presided earlier in the poem. Just to add, scum is Césaire's word. It's used with deliberate irony. But in an inversion of phallic biology, it is in the coital aftermath of ejaculation that Black Africans begin unexpectedly standing on every available surface. So here we are, this is the climax of the poem, this slave ship, its belly splits open and ejaculates human beings. And as the human beings have, after their ejaculation, they start to stand on everything that they can stand on. This includes the hold of the ship, its cabins, its deck. They stand in wind, under the sun, and in so doing, they recognize themselves, and these are Césaire's words, as standing and free. So deviantly and defiantly, erection follows a distinctly feminine ejaculation, an emanation neither teleological nor constrained, but in Césaire's terms, an ever more ample shudder. Right? It's an ejaculation that goes on and on and on. It's not teleological. By the ejaculatory economy of Notebook, Césaire alchemizes phallicism into a feminized currency, as his speaker affirms. He writes, "My total is ever lengthened by unexpected mintings of baseness." Again, the minting of baseness is this elevation of the base and lengthening. It's a kind of curiously phallic image too. This generative incorporation of feminization continues in Césaire's later collections of poems, including his absolutely wonderful collection from 1948, which is called Solar Throat Slashed. So Frantz Fanon counters the intimate dispossession of the white gaze with a very masculinist maneuver in his theoretical writings. But in Solar Throat Slashed, Césaire defies colonial scopophilia with a regenerative proximity. And this is where this fierce intimacy really comes to the boil, I think. In Solar Throat Slashed, Césaire acknowledges that the colonizer's perception penetrates, making him, as he writes, the most pierced being in the world. Right? The way you look at me, the way you engage with me makes me the most pierced being in the world. Martyrized, beatifically queered as his anatomy is stigmatized, Césaire's speaker turns to the surprisingly aggressive salve that is loving proximity. He writes, "My greatest joy is to foil the blows, ferocity of my intimacy where they expected to find the void." This ferocious intimacy propels his speaker's writing, his poetic ejaculations, or a regenerative, empowering ink that he continually aligns with and compares to sap. This sap, this natural life-affirming gush, runs river-like through solar throat slashed, regenerating Césaire's masculine speaker at his most despairing, as in this instance where his speaker announces himself nullified. "I am stark naked. I have discarded everything, my genealogy, my widow, my companions. I await the boiling. I await the baptism of sperm." Unmoored, this speaker finds himself in the midst of a cataclysm, an outpouring of great rivers, and by this cataclysm, Césaire becomes a fecund, procreative being. "I am pregnant with my despair in my arms. I am pregnant with my hunger in my arms and my disgust in my mouth. I am invested. Europe patrols my veins like a pack of filariae at the stroke of midnight, to think that their philosophies try to provide them with morals." Fecund, Césaire's speaker moves toward the communal, telling Europe as he concludes that he has joined all that has the courage to be eternally new, all that knows how to yield its heart up to the fire, all that has the strength to emerge from an inexhaustible sap, all that is calm and certain, or all that is not you, Europe. Defying Western modernity, Césaire feminizes and rebirths himself. He recognizes that rather than fight over the feminization of bodies, the avant-garde might draw strength from its historically shunned complexities. So in 1974, Fran Ross offers us a feminist adolescent redirecting masculinized radicalism in the mythology of the Black superwoman. But before Ross, Aimé Césaire incorporates the feminine to challenge paternalistic imperialism, combining righteous anger with a sustaining intimacy that is neither totalizing nor individualistic. And this is just my concluding sort of shot, which is to think about Arthur Rimbaud's famous "I am another, I am other," and compare it to Césaire's line, "Embrace me unto furious us." Okay, that's it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was brilliant talk. Really just fascinating texts. Are they just incredible? So rich, so much going on, and just the lovely navigation of both of them.
Thank you.
Chaps, I think we know what to do. If the questions in the chat, or pop your screens on and stick your hand up and just ask away. I can start obviously, but it'd be good to get the conversation going between everybody here. I don't want to focus too much on one text and then not the other, but I would like to talk about Oreo because it just seems brilliant. I did a bit of cursory reading around some sort of recent-ish last decade kind of reviews of the book as it was coming out or republished. There was a piece in the New Yorker which I think also functioned as the introduction to one of the new editions that I read. And there's a piece by Marlon James in The Guardian that was quite rich and insightful as well. I suppose what struck me was about Oreo's reception when it came out in 1974, and that it didn't fare so well. You know, it kind of faded from obscurity into obscurity quite quickly, and it's often, at least in these sort of readings, it's juxtaposed with Roots, the book that was really successful at the time and kind of had its own cultural impact. It was bestseller, all those sorts of things. So is that part of your analysis, that kind of that idea of how Oreo wasn't accepted in the kind of the culture at the time, or the publishing culture at the time, or in the literary culture at the time, and why that might be? Is it something to do with those resistant qualities that you've kind of started to draw out in that presentation? It doesn't fit easily into certain categories. It's a bit difficult. It's a bit gnarly. It's a bit thorny. What do you think the story is there?
There's so many, it's such a good question. I think there's so many ways to think through why Ross doesn't get picked up by mainstream culture. she's doing this thing that's really uncomfortable, and it's not like we're roots, which like every I grew up in Canada, and every middle class household had a copy of Roots in it. I remember when I was a kid, it was just like the standard text that you would see in every was a kind of outright, straightforward kind of historical fiction about the development of the Middle Passage, and it was a novel as I remember it, because I believe I read it when I was a teenager. Of overcoming, like a really explicit kind of heroic overcoming of unimaginably awful circumstances. And people who read Ross's Oreo were extraordinarily perplexed by it. It was described as a combination of Uncle Remus and Lenny Bruce, like Lenny Bruce, the Jewish comedian, and Uncle Remus, who is now still a very contentious figure in a sort of a dialect-laden, stereotypical set of stories about African Americans. It's a really hard text to read, Oreo, because it does use a lot of Yiddish words, for instance. So it doesn't really invite you into the text. And there's so many in-jokes in it that you have to be really have to do a lot of work to uncover, as which is the case really with a lot of satirical work, is that it's really of its time. And we expect to have to do that kind of work when we're reading an 18th century text, by Pope, but we don't expect to have to do that kind of work when we're reading something from 1974. But the other thing is that Ross, she dies tragically young. So this is the only novel we have. She was a writer for Richard Pryor, the comedian, and she actually writes a little bit about this. Who was, of course, also world famous at this period in time, right? He couldn't have been a more famous figure. But Ross, as I said at the beginning, she was at the very much at the margins. I think some people wouldn't even consider her part of the Black arts movement. And there's something there, which is always true about the avant-garde, is that it shuns a public always, right? It sort of aesthetically is against the idea of doing anything mainstream. But fundamentally, the people who immediately enter the canon as avant-garde writers are very good self-publicists, and I don't think that Ross, so that's just always been its paradox of I wouldn't possibly speak to the masses, but I'm really good at self-promotion, like Ezra Pound was a terrific self-promoter. And I just don't think Ross, she wasn't a self-promoter in that way, and nor was an African American woman like making Jewish and African American jokes in a very complex, highly hyper feminist novel going to be readily taken up by an American public. I don't think, like, it's not a heroic novel in a way that's legible to a lot of people.
Brilliant, fantastic. Reese, I can see you got your hand up there, so I'll let you jump in.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Joe, and thanks, Sarah. It was a really interesting talk. I was really interested in this kind of conversation, I guess, that you were teasing out between like the 30s and the 70s. And I was thinking the whole time, I was interested to know where you see this conversation carrying on now, like what text you might be reading that you might be interested in as kind of responses to this time period.
To the contemporary, you mean?
Yeah, just so we have a sense of this kind of conversation happening from the 30s and the 70s, and I'm wondering what you're kind of looking at that's come out maybe in the past 10, 20 years or so, or whether that's just outside of the scope of what you're interested in.
I mean, that is not at the minute where, I mean, there's so many great African American avant-garde writers coming out right now and finally being recognized as important precisely because they're writing so well about the issues of race, which would have been the very reason that Ross would have been. I think of people like Don Lundy Martin, who's just such a terrific poet, for instance, who's writing devastatingly about race and identity issues. I got in touch with Michelle Wallace. She wrote this book in 1978, and there is a wave of work right now that is doing. There's some new biographies that have come out about figures from Black Panthers, the female figures of Black Panthers, and Michelle Wallace, as I say, is very open in her work on the Superwoman. She says that. When I look back on it, I was also being influenced by the press coverage. The press coverage was really interested in Black Power as a masculinist, heroic movement, like a lot of men with black berets and black leather jackets and guns, right? We all know these images, like Beyonce played on them when she was presenting at the Super Bowl, or playing at the Super Bowl. And what's happening now is this incredible array of Black feminist scholars in the United States are like, hey, wait a second. From the 1970s onward, Black Power was actually doing like just really frontline work of like feeding kids in schools and like trying to do the kind of work that is not ever seen as heroic, right? Work you might argue is feminized, domestic kind of labor. And that kind of recovery work, it means that there's a new biography of Erica Huggins that's just come out that I've just received and I'm looking forward to reading. And there's just a lot of new interpretive work that's reinstating some of what we might readily call the kind of feminist ethos, actually, of the later stages of the Black Panthers. That is not just about these kind of made for movie moments where the Black Panthers are, confronting the police. I mean, that's not a fair assessment either, obviously, because their strategy was extraordinary, and that movement was so important. But so much of what mattered about Black Power was about caregiving, actually, caregiving within Black communities, that were impoverished and struggling for all kinds of really obvious reasons, and, institutionalized reasons. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really interesting answer. Appreciate that.
Thanks.
Thanks, Reese. I'm just going to go quickly to the chat to Liz, just to repeat something that she put, unless Liz wants to speak to it, but I can just read that out for you, Sarah. Liz says, I'm curious as to if you've considered traversing gendered Black avant-gardes through Afro-pessimism, especially given the idea of myth of the superwoman, etc. So how it relates to Afro-pessimism, your research, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'd be interested to know. I don't know if Liz is comfortable speaking about that, about like where she wants to go with that particular question. Is she able to talk a little bit more to it?
Hey, I'm here. Thank you.
Thanks.
And also, again, thank you, Sarah. I appreciate your time, and thank you, Joseph, for organizing this. I don't want to answer the question. I'm more so maybe are you familiar with Afro-pessimism? Okay. Yeah. I think for me, when I hear the ideas of the myth of the superwoman, it really just kind of takes me to the idea that Black woman is not woman and is woman, and so kind of outside of the binary of critical anti-colonial work, that I think Afro-pessimism really kind of takes us outside of that binary thinking, which I think really seems to have an alignment with some of the other texts that you raised. So I think my question more so is if there's a connection that you see naturally between those texts as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that the work that I'm looking at, this recovery of these like forgotten or neglected figures within Black Power, is not addressing the terms of Afro-pessimism. So I guess what my response to that question, which is an excellent question, is like that is something that is worth me taking away with me and having a think about. But it's a curious absence, actually, in some of the work that I've been looking at. That it's not engaging directly with those terms. The way you framed it is quite compelling. So I'm really grateful for that incursion. Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. Yeah.
Thanks.
Brilliant. Evie.
Yeah. Yes. Hello. Sorry. Okay, I managed to turn on my camera. Can I take down my hand as well? Yes, I can. Thanks for your talk, Sarah, and for sharing this really interesting material. I'm still kind of hooked or stuck on your last slide where you had the Rimbaud quotation next to Césaire. And I know that you did it as a sort of mic drop, so I'm not really meant to ask about it.
No.
Just so kind of suggestive and tempting that I was wondering if you could say a little more about where you see the resonances between the two. Or whether they maybe just need to be suggested and not further explained.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you asked that question because I'm totally happy to have a conversation about it. I think there's just something about, I mean, don't get me wrong, I love Rimbaud, and that quotation is overquoted, obviously, and used excessively. Césaire, in his like what's sort of seen as his Ars Poetica, which is poetry and thinking, this wonderful essay that he wrote. He cites, as I mentioned, that Baudelaire and Rimbaud are utterly integral to the way that he thinks. But I guess when I put those two quotations together, as much as Rimbaud's quotation is often held up as as Rimbaud, I think the way that I keep reading criticism about that quotation is it gets used as a kind of placeholder for I am dispersing myself. I am like turning toward the other as a kind of site of inspiration. I always feel like there's something slightly appropriative about it too, right? Like I am the other and I can choose to be that in this way that's like very, of its time, of a kind of late 19th century ethos. And I think Césaire is so clearly influenced by decadence, not only because he's so interested in the perverse and manipulating the perverse in a way that's really in your face, but also challenging cultural norms via the perverse, but also the very lush richness of his extraordinary, beautiful poetry, and powerful poetry. But I think I feel that embrace me unto furious us is a way of using those kinds of terms of I am other, I am othered, but it's also so much more inclusive, right? The use of an inclusive pronoun, I think, is really I want to be part of an inclusive pronoun, not just to appropriate the other, but to be in a world of an us and a we rather than an I that can pick up and put down the other at my own will. And I think there's something about that, the ferocity of it and the kind of tone of it feels very decadent, but it also feels like here I am in 1939 writing as the position of a colonized subject, reworking the terms of decadence and pushing it further than decadence was able to go from its own kind of Eurocentric mindset. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Brilliant. Does anyone else have a question at this point? We're close to the end, but we can fit in probably a few more comments or observations or questions. I was curious, more, kind of in a broader sense, Sarah, about how this fits within your wider research and where this is going. Because is this the start of something? Is it part of something that's ongoing? Where is this situated within all the brilliant research that you've done previously? And yeah, is this part of a new direction or?
It is that. That's a really generous question. I am there. I think that the writing about Oreo is trying to think about. I'm working right now with Juno Jill Richards, who's at Yale, and a number of mostly American scholars actually on a project about toxicity in the avant-garde and trying to think through how. I mean, toxicity within the avant-garde is in many ways an old subject. Like when I'm talking about Susan Suleiman writing this book, Subversive Intent, like that's a 30-year-old text where she's saying, hey, the avant-garde is thinks it's so cutting edge, but it's so bourgeois in the way that it's presenting gender fundamentally is what she's arguing there, and she's going through a lot of source text to get to that very clear statement about it. And I think there's been a lot of work, there definitely has been a lot of work, I'm well aware of this, that is trying to decolonize the avant-garde. And Sacha Brou, who works in Belgium, is a major figure with whom I'm in a lot of conversation. He's a wonderful scholar about decolonizing the avant-garde. But a lot of that work, in my opinion, has been a kind of, it's reclaiming lost figures, or it is celebrating sort of adversity overcome, basically. Like, yes, the avant-garde was sexist, yes, the avant-garde was homophobic, yes, it was racist, but look how far we've come. There's a lot of that kind of work going on right now. So this project that I'm working on with Juno Jill Richards is about trying to sit with the ugly, basically what we keep saying, to like lean into the ugly of it and just really dissect and anatomize what happens within the avant-garde. So thinking about Fran Ross's engagement with, or resistance to engaging with, Black Power, or her kind of commentary on it, is part of a larger project about how, in fact, there's a lot of autobiographical text from women like Erica Huggins and various people, that women who were involved in Black Power, who have a lot to say about how difficult it was to be women in those movements. So we're trying to like actually just stay with that rather than just move forward or kind of celebrate a change. So that's one project that I think Oreo is doing some interesting work in, openly critiquing some of that stuff. And the work on Césaire is actually under review right now and getting some positive, which is, I'm very grateful for, some positive responses from reviewers from a journal. It's a part of a larger project that I'm also working on impotence in literature. And so the Césaire project, I have a longer essay that is from, but it encompasses quite a few international figures. And I'm working on an edited collection on impotence in literature, which when you start looking for is absolutely everywhere. So impotence is kind of both a sexual condition that's a challenge to the masculine or to the perceived masculine, but also as a psychosocial condition, which Freud actually says is the basis of psychoanalysis and believes is one of the most major and pressing concerns of contemporary society. And I think it's absolutely a modernist concern in the way that I have been a modernist for many years, but it's also it's so contemporary in the sense that I think we all feel a kind of powerlessness and a kind of cut-off rightness right now in relation to world events. So this is sort of blossoming, and there's quite a few people who, and I'm really happy to hear suggestions for people to approach to contribute to this project, because I'm trying to make it a very decolonizing project too, so that it's not just about white male anxiety about sexual prowess, but that is where that's where the Césaire stuff is going right now, is part of a larger project. So I'm doing an edited collection and working toward a monograph on impotence in literature. Yeah.
Brilliant. Yeah, definitely a good idea to diversify that, because I can imagine, yeah,
Yeah.
submissions of a similar stripe appearing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we've crossed the threshold past 5 p.m. and it's always rude to keep people. I could keep going on all day, because there's just so much in those texts, and just reading around those texts, it's just so rich. And Fran Ross as an individual as well is fascinating.
She's
and
amazing.
just there's so much more to unpack, so conversations for other times perhaps. But can I just say thank you to Sarah for a brilliant presentation. Only a few technical niggles that just
I'm
went
so
away.
sorry.
They just
Yeah, yeah.
disappeared. So that's absolutely fine.
Thanks for your
and just-
patience. Yeah.
Not
Yeah.
at all, no. And just thanks everyone for attending on a Thursday afternoon. Cheers. Thanks all.
Thank you, everybody.